The 1930s in the United Kingdom were a time of major economic, political, and social upheaval. Picture this: the country is reeling from the effects of the Great Depression, a time when the streets were lined with people struggling to find work, and the economy was hanging by a thread. But despite all the turmoil, this decade also saw some pretty significant technological advances, shifts in culture, and political drama that would shape the future of the UK. Let's break it down. First up, we have the economic conditions. The UK was heavily reliant on industries like coal mining, textiles, steel, and shipbuilding. But these industries were struggling. International competition was fierce, and demand just wasn't what it used to be. The UK's exports were mostly machinery, chemicals, and other manufactured goods, while they were importing things like oil, rubber, and food. Trade, especially with former colonies, was key to survival, but the empire's grip on the world was starting to slip. With tariffs from other countries complicating things, the UK tried to stabilize the economy by putting up trade barriers and striking deals with its empire. Still, the economy wasn't recovering fast enough, and unemployment was everywhere, especially in industrial towns. Now, even though things weren't great economically, the 1930s saw some fascinating innovations. Let's talk about aviation. It was booming. You've probably heard of Sir Charles Kingsford Smith or Amelia Earhart. These figures weren't just famous for flying across the globe. They helped push aviation into the mainstream and influenced both technology and popular culture. The automobile industry was also picking up steam, although it was mostly a luxury for the rich at that point. Meanwhile, electric technology was making life more interesting, with radio becoming a household staple, shaping how people consumed news and entertainment. Even in the industrial sector, some areas were innovating with mechanization and mass production, though many parts of the country were still stuck in the past, using outdated methods. Politically, the 1930s were a roller coaster. The UK was still trying to recover from World War I, and the empire's role on the world stage was becoming more complicated. Tensions with India were growing, and domestically, the government was focused on tackling economic stagnation. The Labour Party, under figures like Clement Attlee, was pushing for social reform, wanting to improve the lives of the working class. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party, well, they were all about austerity, keeping things traditional, and not shaking up the status quo. And then, there was the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, which created a new set of problems for Britain. How do you deal with a growing threat like that? With diplomacy, military preparation, and some tough decisions. Although the UK wasn't fully embroiled in another world war just yet, military preparations were well underway. The British Army was mostly focused on maintaining the empire, but there wasn't much investment in modern mechanized forces. However, the Royal Air Force, RAF, was making strides, particularly in reconnaissance and combat aviation. They were preparing for the possibility of air warfare, investing in more sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, which was still one of the world's most powerful, was feeling the heat from Germany's expanding naval force. The UK was also exploring new military strategies, particularly in aerial and naval warfare, anticipating that any future conflict would play out in the skies and on the seas. Life for many people during the 1930s was full of social uncertainty. The Great Depression hit hard, leaving people jobless and struggling. Unemployment rates soared, and many workers took to the streets in strikes and protests. There were huge divisions between the working class and the upper class, with the poor facing hardship and the wealthy largely untouched by the economic struggles. People were dissatisfied with the government, with many seeing it as out of touch with the struggles of everyday citizens. But still, the monarchy remained a fixture in British life, though its role was becoming more symbolic. And internationally, Britons had mixed feelings about their empire. On one hand, there was pride in their national identity and what the empire had represented. But on the other hand, growing tensions in Europe and the looming threat of another war made the future feel uncertain. When it came to welfare, healthcare, and quality of life, things weren't looking great for the working class. There were some welfare programs, but they were limited, and most social services were basic at best. Healthcare was mostly private, though public health campaigns were starting to take off, like the push to tackle tuberculosis and improve hygiene. For many, life was tough, particularly in industrial cities like Glasgow, Manchester, and Birmingham, where poverty was rampant. But for the middle class, life wasn't too bad, and suburban living was becoming more fashionable for those who could afford it. In terms of ethnic makeup, the UK was largely white, mostly English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. Immigration was limited, though there were some communities of Jewish, Irish, Indian, and West Indian descent, particularly in urban areas like London. That said, there was some growing anti-immigrant sentiment, especially with the rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism across Europe. Many Britons also looked to emigrate, with places like Canada, Australia, and the United States offering better opportunities. But the Great Depression made it harder for people to leave, and fewer were able to make the move. Even though the UK was in a tough spot economically and politically, the arts and culture were thriving. Cinema became a major cultural force. Movies like The 39 Steps were huge hits and captured the public's imagination. Art Deco and modernism were all the rage, influencing design across the country. Writers like George Orwell and Virginia Woolf explored the social complexities of the time, while playwrights like Noel Coward and J.B. Priestley tackled the political and social issues of the day. Jazz and swing music were starting to influence youth culture, and radio broadcasts helped spread the tunes to every corner of the country. Religion, particularly Christianity, remained central to British life, with the Church of England still holding sway. But at the same time, there was a rise in interest in mysticism, the occult, and New Age spiritual movements, especially among intellectuals. People were looking for answers, and not necessarily from traditional religious institutions. The 1930s were a time when alternative beliefs started to gain more traction, though they didn't reach the levels seen in other parts of Europe. Folklore also played a big part in British culture. Stories of King Arthur, Robin Hood, and ancient Celtic myths remained popular. The countryside was rich with local legends. Tales of ghosts, fairies, and mythical creatures were still very much alive, especially in rural areas. And in the cities, the popularity of horror fiction and horror films began to shape modern myths, with people fascinated by darker, supernatural tales. In terms of notable events, the 1930s had a few that stood out. The abdication crisis of 1936, where King Edward VIII gave up the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson, shocked the nation. Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists also rose to prominence during the decade, representing the growing threat of fascism in Britain. Then, there was the looming shadow of the Nazi threat in Germany, which would eventually push Britain to reevaluate its defense policies. And let's not forget about the General Strike of 1926, which still loomed large in the minds of many working-class Britons, reminding them of the volatility of the times. When it comes to stereotypes, there were a few that defined how people saw the British. The British were often stereotyped as reserved, polite, and with that signature stiff upper lip attitude, a sign of their ability to endure hardship. The working-class Brit was seen as stoic and reliable, constantly dealing with economic hardship but not complaining about it. Meanwhile, the British aristocracy was often viewed as out of touch with the reality of life for ordinary people, and there was growing resentment toward them. Lastly, the idea of the British Empire as this great, powerful force was still strong, though it was becoming increasingly questioned by the end of the decade. So there you have it, the 1930s in the UK. It was a decade of struggle, but also one of change and adaptation. From the economic hardships to the cultural innovations, the political unrest to the rise of new beliefs, it's clear that this period shaped much of what we know about modern Britain today. Thanks for tuning in to The World as We Know It, and joining me in another chapter of world history. As always, there are more detailed notes in the description, and we welcome any requests or recommendations in the comments section. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or educational, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.